welcome to the Mental Breakdown. I'm Dr. Berney.
And I'm Dr. Richard.
Good morning, Richard.
Good morning. Friday. Happy Friday.
It is Friday.
Right?
And if it's Friday, we are recording the Mental
It
Breakdown.
can only mean one thing.
That's
We're
right.
recording the podcast.
And we're looking ahead at a day that we have too much to do and not enough time to get it all done in. Plenty of reports to write, plenty of things to do to finish up the week.
The work that we have to do will far exceed the time we have to do it in.
Exactly.
Okay.
Well, you know, one of the things I had wanted to mention that I had an opportunity to do last night was I got to call in to another podcast last night.
A nighttime podcast.
Yeah, it's a podcast called Lost or Profound. The hosts are Derek and Brian. And it's a podcast. It's a relatively new podcast. There's about 8 episodes so far, and but they talk about all kinds of things. And last night they were talking about something we would call here like cognitive dissonance, or when people hold beliefs about something despite evidence of the contrary. And so they had that topic, and they wanted a psychologist to come on and join in the conversation with them. So I did that, and it was a lot of fun. Derek and Brian, both really smart guys, funny guys. It's a much more what I would call relaxed podcast as compared to ours. They
and
use
somewhat irreverent.
Yes, they use a set of vocabulary that we don't use here, but that's okay because it was really good information, and it's what I like about being able to participate in podcasts like that is because it's very, very down to earth, very real, and addressing issues that I think need to be discussed.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little bit unusual for me because usually when I'm doing my podcast, I get to sit across the table from you, and
right.
we can see each other, and I feel like I'm talking to you. And for that podcast, I was on the phone. I was sitting on my bed on the phone talking with them.
You were at home on your phone,
talking with them, and it was
that adds a dimension.
Yeah, it was a little bit weird, but it was really good discussion. And so I would encourage anyone who is interested in that topic to go check it out. They do have a E rating, so do be aware of
E rating.
A E for explicit. They use colorful language sometimes.
Okay.
Not for the sake of using it.
Right,
it's within context, but just know that going into it, I suppose.
So it's more of an adult.
Yeah.
Not during the family hour.
Correct. But it was a great conversation.
Good. So you had fun?
And I did have
did
a lot of
fun. Anything?
I did. And one of the things that we talked about with that is related to this series that we're doing here, and that is, how do you make change? How do you alter your perspectives of something? How do you change the way that you're thinking about something? And the way that we're talking about it here, of course, is all about setting goals and working to attain those goals. So if your goal is to, change the way that you feel about something, or that you want to change how you're doing something, or how you feel about something, there was a bit of an overlap, I thought.
So was last night's topic on change, or is it generally about altering people's opinions?
No, for that podcast, they cover a broad variety of topics. Some of their previous topics, they had one called Rage. I'm really interested to listen to that one. They had one on religion. So they have them about different topics. So and last night's just happened to be on basically on cognitive dissonance. I think that they titled the podcast "Communicating with Stupid." I think was the name of the podcast.
I'll have to listen to that.
So yeah, but that's sort of an a cue to the more down to earth,
right,
irreverent, as you said, approach to talking about it. But very good, and I really appreciated being on that podcast.
And it was called A Conversation with Stupid?
Communicating with Stupid, I think was the name of the...
An election year is a good time to discuss that topic.
Yes, but maybe we need to have another podcast where we talk about politics.
I'm ready. I want to talk about education, but
this is before we get into motivation. Let me just say this: since I got here this morning, Dr. Richard has been a little bit agitated. He's been on fire.
The word is irascible.
Well, I wouldn't use that word. I would say he's on fire. And he's revved up because of all this stuff. And for those of you who are listening who don't live in this area, there's a lot of issues. Controversy is a good word. Going on with our education system and with some other things happening here in our local community. And because we're sort of involved in some of that, and we're following it closely, and it is frustrating us greatly.
If I may add, I am terribly disturbed about what's going on in education today in the name of reform.
Right.
And I just think we have to put a stop to it pretty soon.
Right.
We'll talk about that another time, but I'm very, very concerned about our public school system.
Well, we're way behind in our Paideia podcast, so we'll have to catch up with that and record a Paideia podcast this weekend to cover some of that.
Yeah,
does that sound okay?
Need to catch up on those.
Yeah.
We need to make people. We need to start a discussion about what's happening to our children, because this is happening to our children, and what's happening should not be happening, and the policies that are being pushed on us need to change. They need to stop.
Right.
And, I don't know how to make that happen, but I think we need to at least begin that discussion.
Well, let's use that as the way that we'll transition to our topic for today, and that is we're now moving to the next obstacle that often arises when we're trying to set goals and accomplish our goals. So far in this little series that we've done, we have talked about fear. We've talked about stopping old habits. We've talked about how to manage the uncomfortable feelings of getting outside of your comfort zone. And today we're going to talk about motivation. And we've talked a lot about motivation, both in workshops that we've done. Our workshop last month was on motivation. We've written about it in our Ledger article column, and so we've been talking about it a lot, but we really haven't talked about it in this way, because what we need to do, I think, is maybe just start with what the heck is motivation anyways?
Right.
We talk about it a lot. We use that word a lot, but we don't really, I don't know that people really know what motivation is. So let's start there. What is motivation? Where does it come from? And what drives us? Because, motivation is a drive. What drives us for some things, but not other things?
Right. And I think when there's two ways to look at this motivation business. If you're in academics, if you're an educational psychologist, let's say, motivation is a very difficult thing to study because we really don't know what it is.
Right.
You can't measure it. You can't observe it. You kind of know when somebody is motivated, but if you look at a classroom of children, how do you know which one is
right.
motivated and which one isn't? If you're studying, that's why aggression is studied.
Right.
Because you can see aggression.
It's observable.
Okay? Right. But you can't see motivation. So you can't observe it, you can't measure it. So for academicians, motivation is difficult to study because you can't observe and measure it.
Right.
For parents and teachers, motivation is difficult because it's one of those things that we just don't know how to increase somebody's motivation. We can offer bribes, we can offer money, we can offer food, we can offer all kinds of rewards, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't.
Right.
And that tells us that there's something about motivation that remains mysterious. So whether you're an academician trying to study it as a phenomenon, cognitive phenomenon, or whether you're a parent or teacher trying to increase a child's motivation, it's a very unclear, cloudy topic and we really don't know exactly what it is.
Right. Now, what we do know is that there are two types of motivation.
Right.
There's intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation, and I think that the closest. I'm trying to tread carefully here. The closest that we can get to what you're talking about as far as what is observable, what we can measure, the closest we can get to that when it comes to motivation is extrinsic motivation.
Right.
Is there something that I can offer you that gives you enough drive to do what I want you to do?
Right. And I think the key there is for me to do what you want me to do.
Right.
Okay, because that's what parents and teachers struggle with.
Right.
Is that we want children to do what we want them to do.
Right.
And that's what is so terribly difficult to
Right.
accomplish.
Right. And to generalize it outside of just kids, many times we do that to ourselves or to our spouses or to our friends. And if we want them to do something, we'll say, hey, if you come along with me here, I know that you don't want to go to this wedding with me, but if you go to the wedding with me, I'll take you out to dinner afterwards. Right. So we're offering them something to serve as a motivator, because without that extrinsic motivator, they're not going to do it.
Right.
So we know we know what extrinsic motivation is, and we know the relative strengths and weaknesses of motivation. Extrinsic motivation. The short story with that is extrinsic motivation is only as powerful as the motivator is important to the person.
Right.
If you really don't want to go to dinner after the wedding, it's really that motivation, that extrinsic motivator, isn't really going to be very powerful in encouraging you to accompany me.
Right. And the other thing about extrinsic motivation, if you're just talking about a single event, I want you to go to this wedding.
Right.
Then we come up with some kind of a negotiation in a
Right.
trade. Say, if you go here, if you do this, I'll do this.
Right.
It's very different when we want somebody to do something every day. For example, a parent wants the child to do homework every night.
Right.
That's much more difficult to achieve when we want something to occur every night.
Right.
Versus a single event.
Right.
Single event's easy.
Right.
You say, if you do this, I'll do this. Okay, good. But when you're talking about doing something every day, like getting to school on time or doing your homework or doing your chores, then extrinsic motivation becomes a little more difficult and a little less effective.
Right. Yeah, and we've used the example before of the person who tells themselves or sort of negotiates with themselves and says, okay, well, if you go to the gym and work out, then you can reward yourself on the way home with a milkshake.
Right.
Or now, the silliness of that aside, because you're undoing what you've done, what you were working on in the gym, pretty soon the milkshake isn't going to be very important anymore. Right. I mean, the reason that the milkshake is important right now is it's because perhaps you've been depriving yourself of it because you're trying to eat better or whatever. And so you're saying, wow, that's something that I really want right now, so I'm going to use that as my motivator. Mm-hmm. Well, what happens when you're sort of satiated with milkshakes? You don't want a milkshake today. Right. Does that mean you don't go to the gym? Mm-hmm. And that's where the world of extrinsic motivation begins to crumble. And I think that teachers see that a lot, parents see that a lot, and again, we see that a lot in ourselves, even as adults. Right,
and parents and teachers shouldn't be too self-critical about this, because it's not that you're not coming up with an effective intervention or you don't know how to do, how to increase motivation. It's just that in the long haul, extrinsic motivation isn't going to work indefinitely. I mean, it's just not going to work indefinitely. Everybody will want a little bit more, whether it's money or milkshakes or whatever. If you pay somebody to do something, okay, that's good. I'm glad I'm making $10 an hour, but eventually you're going to want $12 an hour. I mean, it's just human nature. Right. So long-term extrinsic motivation isn't as effective as we used to think it might be. Right, and that's, this will be a topic that we've really considered talking about in a single podcast, and that is spanking. Right. Yeah. Good example. Spanking is a motivator to stop doing something. Right. I'm going to motivate you to stop doing this by spanking you. And the research is pretty clear.
It's only effective for a period of time and in certain situations. And after that, it's not really effective anymore.
Right.
So again, regardless of how you're using motivation to increase a behavior or when you're using extrinsic motivation, whether you're trying to increase a behavior or decrease a behavior, there are limitations to extrinsic motivation. What we really want, what we would really like to, when we talk about how do we create motivation, what we're really talking about is intrinsic motivation.
Right.
And intrinsic motivation is that internal drive, that I want to do this just for the sake of doing it, just for the pleasure of doing it. And when we think about it that way, I think that it's not surprising when we say, well, my son's really not motivated to do homework. Well, what you're saying is he's not intrinsically driven to do homework on his own. And not a lot of kids are, to spend 7.5 hours at school and then come home and spend 2 more hours doing homework. There's not a lot of intrinsic drive there. And the kids that are driven, well, we'll get to why they're driven in just a few minutes. But these kinds of intrinsic drives really have a biological basis, right? When the example, Richard, that you used just before we went on air is when you're really thirsty, you're going to find something to drink. We've heard of people who have been out on lifeboats for extended periods of time. When you get thirsty enough, it's pretty surprising what you'll drink.
Right.
But that's our innate intrinsic drives. And we have a few of those intrinsic drives. It's called drive theory.
Right. One of the things we do know about motivation, what we always want is intrinsic motivation. We just talked about extrinsic and how difficult it is to maintain extrinsic motivation. But our real goal is intrinsic motivation. We either, let's take homework, pursuing that example. We either want our children to do homework or they're willing to do homework. Either one is acceptable. They're willing to do it or they want to do it.
Right.
I'll take willing anytime. Okay. I'd like for them to want to do it for its own sake because they're learning something and learning is important. But I'm certainly certainly acceptable to say yes, my kids are willing to do their homework. So either one, it's intrinsic. Now, one of the things about motivation that is worth mentioning anytime you talk about motivation. We have to remember that in addition to all these cultural things like school and losing weight and for having relationships, we are also biological organisms. We're part of the animal kingdom.
Right.
And in the animal kingdom, we have certain behaviors that must be done, certain drives, innate drives, that have to be satisfied. For example, we have to eat.
Right.
Okay. So we get hungry, and we get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier, and eventually you'll eat almost anything. The same with thirst. It's the same with elimination.
Right.
All of these, there are about 8 or 10 behaviors that are called consumatory behaviors or appetitive from the word appetite, appetitive behaviors that we are going to satisfy.
Right.
And in that case, motivation is a function of deprivation. There's a whole science of comparative biology where we talk about motivation as a function of deprivation. And your motivation will increase as deprivation increases.
Right.
The more deprived you are, the more motivated you are. That's in biology.
Right.
Hunger, thirst, those sorts of things. So that's one way of looking at motivation. But we're talking about motivation for things that aren't life-sustaining.
Right.
Like grades in school. Okay?
Right.
That's not. So for those things, there's much less motivation.
Right.
Typically, and it's harder to create. You can't just create motivation for homework, and you can, but it's very difficult to do. But an example of creating motivation is what B.F. Skinner did when he did his experiments. He wanted animals to perform a certain way. Well, he just deprived them of food.
I was going to say, he built upon that basic biological need, and that's how he got them to do what he wanted them to do.
If he wanted a pigeon to peck, I mean, when pigeons are hungry, they peck. Okay?
Right.
So he wanted pigeons to peck. So he reduced their body weight by 20%, and they were starving. They would have done anything. We did the same thing with whales and dolphins at these water parks, at places like SeaWorld and that, where we deprived them of. They're starving. Those animals will do anything to get those fish. I mean, you couldn't put a whale with a full stomach and say, okay, no, he's going to take a rest. He's going to take a nap. Okay, he's not going to do anything. But if they're hungry, they will do things in order to get food. We can't do that with our children.
Right.
We have fantasies about starving them until they do their homework, but those are fantasies. So you can't deny children, you can deny animals these basic biological things, hunger and thirst. You can't deny your students or your children those sorts of things. Parents have. It's called child abuse. You're not allowed to do it. So we have sanctions against that kind of. So we use whatever means we have, but we're limited in what we can do. The other point about these things is that we often hear that children are lazy.
Right.
And that's another whole topic. Well, he's lazy. He doesn't want to do homework. Mel Levine wrote a wonderful book called The Myth of the Lazy Child.
Right.
And in the book, he reminds us that it's not that children aren't motivated, it's that they're not motivated to do what we want them to do.
Right.
They're motivated to do something,
right,
even if it's to sleep.
Right.
Okay. But everybody's motivated to do something. It may be just to sit on the sofa and watch TV. They're motivated to do that. But when we talk about motivation, we're talking about they're not motivated to do what we want them to do, either parents or teachers.
And I think that's a great point, because oftentimes when we hear from parents that, he's just not motivated to do anything, as soon as the kid sits down on our couch and we start talking to them, they like playing video games, they watch movies on videos on YouTube, they like talking with their friends,
right.
they there's lots of things that they enjoy doing. Right. It's just that they don't prefer to do what their parents and teachers need them to do,
right,
and what the parents and teachers want them to do. And that's a very different phenomenon. That's a very different set of circumstances.
Right.
I've never really met a kid who isn't motivated to do anything.
That's right.
Though that's when we start getting into severe depression. Kids who are severely depressed,
right,
they have something called anhedonia, which is a condition and set of symptoms that makes them not have a lot of difficulty finding pleasure in doing anything. And so, when people are anhedonic, they really have a difficult time finding pleasure in things, and of course that impacts their motivation. But that's depressed. That's a pathological condition.
That's a pathological condition. And we have kids who, we see children and teenagers who don't want to do anything. They don't want to participate in scouts. They don't want to participate in sports. It's not because they're lazy. Some of those kids are so depressed that nothing has any interest. And if you've ever been an adult and gone through a bout of depression, you know exactly how that feels.
Absolutely.
You're just not motivated to do anything. But that's a separate category.
Right.
Okay. We're not talking about a pathological condition. We're talking about normal motivation in kids who are not depressed.
Right. And one of our listeners was just chatting with us in the chat room about this. In what happens when we're severely depressed is what it really comes down to is our body isn't creating if we want to get down to the chemistry, our body's not creating the neurotransmitters that says, this feels great.
Feels good. Right.
And so what we have to do in those situations is, as difficult as it is, and it's easy to sit here in front of a microphone and say, we just got to get you to find some things that turn you on. I know that that's difficult, and working with patients with those kinds of difficulties is challenging. But what we have to do, if we want to create some of that drive, we have to create some success. We have to get our patients, we have to get our children, we have to get our students, we have to get ourselves to do something and experience the joy of success. And that will begin to pull us out of that depression. It'll pull us out of that absence of motivating state, and begin us to start driving towards some of these other goals.
I'm going to underline that. If it doesn't create feel good
Right.
somewhere in your brain, you're probably not going to do it again.
Right.
I mean, this is all driven eventually by brain chemicals. When we say that was satisfying, or I liked that, I enjoyed that, and I'd like to do it again, it's because your brain is producing those feel-good chemicals.
Right.
Okay. There's we have a wonderful colleague. Her name is Judy Willis. She's a pediatric neurologist who, after she had a child, went back to school and got a master's in education. And now she gave up her practice as a neurologist. She teaches middle school during the school year, and then in the summer she does her neurology practice.
Wow.
Okay, so this is a woman who really understands neurology and the education. And she writes in all of her books, she said, you can't just give kids worksheets to do that are of no interest. If you don't excite those neurotransmitters, the feel-good neurotransmitters, kids are not going to read. They're not going to read only because they're told to do these worksheets and they get better at reading. They're going to read because it produces these neurochemicals.
Right.
And she keeps talking about that and writing about that. And she's absolutely right. If you don't give kids fun things to read, they're not going to read.
Right.
They're not going to pore over this stuff every day if it doesn't produce something in their brain.
I've mentioned my son on the podcast many times before, and Connor's a cool kid, and but reading is not his favorite thing to do. He plays sports and he does other things. But as I've mentioned before, he has, since he was a very small child, said that he was going to become a neurologist. Right. That's what he wanted to do. And the other morning we're on our way to school, and we're having one of our morning conversations, which I've really come to enjoy. And after I dropped him off and I was on my way here to the office, I started thinking about what he and I were just talking about. And we were using words like oligodendrocytes, neuroglia, and I'm thinking, here's a guy who doesn't really enjoy reading all that much, and we're using these 5-syllable words, words that many people can't even pronounce. And he is completely driven by this. He loves this stuff. He texts me throughout the day asking me questions about this stuff, because in his anatomy and physiology class, they're now on the neurological system. And he's loving it. And it's because that makes him feel good. He loves thinking and talking about this stuff. And it doesn't matter the time of day, what's going on with him. He can be very, very cranky in the morning, but as soon as we get in the car and start talking about some of this stuff, all of that crankiness goes away, and he's ready to go, and he's talking and laughing and interacting wonderfully.
Because his brain is producing those feel-good chemicals.
Yeah, okay. He's enjoying it. So that's what we have to do. When we talk about these severe cases, these anhedonic patients and things like that, that's one of the things that we really have to do. If you see your child as being depressed, if you're depressed, we have to find something that is going to increase and create some drive, create some interest, create some chemicals in the brain.
That's important for parents and teachers to understand, that until you get to a point where their brains are producing these feel-good chemicals, none of this is going to work. Okay?
Right. Right. You're going to struggle and struggle and struggle, become frustrated, and the more frustrated you get, the more frustrated they're going to get, and you're not going to get where you need to go. And so you have to find something. And one of the things we tell parents oftentimes is, childhood and adolescence is a great time to try everything.
Right.
Don't restrict yourself to certain things. I have a patient who his parents have him in sailing. We don't have many kids, middle school kids who are learning to become a sailor, on sailboats.
Right.
But it was something that he was interested in, and so the parents, hey, let's give it a shot, and he loves it. So letting your kids explore some of these things, not create crazy schedules where they're doing something different every night. Certainly we're not talking about that, but looking for those things. One of the first things I always ask patients is, what makes you happy? If you could do anything right now, what would it be? And then you build from there. Now, we kind of, obviously this is a topic we feel important.
Yeah, because we've made two important points here. One is that we have these biological drives that we have to satisfy. So a part of our brain is satisfying those biological needs.
Right.
Okay? Hunger, thirst, elimination, reproduction, all those things that we do for the survival of the individual and the survival of the species. That's a fundamental motivation. And again, it's driven by deprivation.
Right.
But then there's this second set of things, more cultural, that we do because they produce those feel-good chemicals.
Right.
Okay? And that's what we're talking about here, is how do we produce the feel-good chemicals? And that's why when you punish children to get them to do something, you're not producing the feel-good chemicals.
Right.
You're going in just the opposite direction.
Right.
The child may do it, but it's not going to be done indefinitely, and it's not going to be done because they're deriving any joy from it. They're going to do it out of fear. But that's headed in the other direction.
And for only as long as that fear is present.
That's right.
That's why we have students who, college freshman years are notorious for students who did relatively well in high school to begin to do very, very poorly. Because now that, for lack of a better word, threat of problem is no longer there.
Right.
And so when that's not there, there's no drive. There's no motivation because they've never really created that. And I think it's a little bit, one of the things that we're kind of really focusing on parents, but for adults as well, and for us as individuals. But, one of the things that we sort of expect for some reason is that, your 8-year-old or 9-year-old or even 12-year-old kid is going to perform behaviors now with the idea that it's going to help them when they're 25 years old. They're not going to be thinking that way.
Doesn't produce the feel-good chemicals right now.
Right. And so we have to adjust our expectations, our understanding of what's happening with kids. And this brings us to more specifically what we're talking about today.
Yeah, it really does. Because
how motivation is important for setting goals and accomplishing your goals.
That's right. Because whether we're talking about changing ourselves, either stopping or starting, or changing another, stopping or starting, we face exactly the same set of circumstances, that we have to somehow create circumstances that produce these feel-good chemicals. That's why addiction is so hard to deal with, so hard to treat, because you have a chemical that is producing the feel-good chemicals, and now you're going to say, well, I want you to stop doing that.
Right.
I want you to stop feeling good. I want you to stop your brain from... Imagine how hard that must be for a person, because here they found something that automatically produces it.
Right.
Or I should say, unfortunately, automatically produces pleasure. It's very, very difficult for the brain to give that up. That's what addiction is.
And going on with that just a little bit is that, a lot of people who work with addictions, they work from the idea that that the addiction itself is a disorder.
Right.
And when we're talking about it in this way, what tends to be the case, the actuality, is that a person isn't feeling good to begin with.
Right.
There's something going on that's making them feel discomfort, and whatever substance it is that they're abusing is relieving them, giving them the feel-good chemicals that was absent before.
Right.
And so when we talk about people, stopping substances, what oftentimes we fail to fix the original problem, and that's why recidivism rates are so high.
Or you take away the drug, take away the chemical. Well, you better replace it with something, because if you just say go and don't do this anymore, well, if there's nothing producing that feel-good chemical, and it can be something as just the success of not using the drugs anymore might produce a good feeling, but it may not be sufficient for everybody.
Right.
And so we have to think in terms of, okay, I'm going to take away the chemicals, but what am I going to use to get that feel-good feeling?
Right. Right.
That has to be, you have to do that in order to sustain intrinsic motivation.
Exactly. So when we're setting goals, when we're back to, a few podcasts ago when we were talking about, you need to identify what your goals are, what you want to accomplish, and identifying where you're headed.
Right.
One of the things that we talked about was your first step needs to be just sit down and write it out. Articulate it in a way that you can put it on a piece of paper and then begin to analyze it a little bit, dissect it a little bit, see, okay, if this is where I am today and this is where I want to be as my eventual goal,
right.
What are the small baby steps from where I am now to where I want to be? Now, so when you sit down and you do that initially, to even be able to do that, you have to have some motivation, right? That's a process. That's not a 2-second process where you just write down, I want to lose 50 pounds. Right? That to go through that process the way that we're recommending you to do it, it's going to require some motivation because it's going to take you some time, it's going to take you some thought, and it's going to take you some effort.
And if you're not willing to do that, you're probably not sufficiently motivated to even begin.
Right. And that's exactly the point.
Right.
That, a lot of times, many people set arbitrary goals that they're really not motivated to meet. They're not really, it's idealized. It's like, I would love to be able to do that. That's it. That's my goal. I'm going to be a millionaire. Okay. How are you going to get there? Do you realize that to get there, that may require you to work 80 hours a week?
Right.
Do you realize that to do that, you have to do this or you have to do that? And for these people, when there's not enough motivation, when they're really not committed to it, that's when they fall off right away. And that's why, 92% of New Year's resolutions fail.
Right.
We don't. 92% of people who set New Year's resolutions don't meet those New Year's resolutions.
As we've said before, resolutions are not goals.
Right. Right. Because they're not to be a goal, a real goal. You have to articulate it. You have to identify those small steps, and that shifts it from a resolution, just some statement, to a real, authentic, actualized goal.
Right.
That shift requires some motivation. Okay? Now, even if you have that initial motivation, we still have to find ways to keep you motivated for the 6 to 12 months or so that it's going to take for you to actualize that goal. When you have a goal that is a big goal for you, it's not going to be something that you accomplish in a matter of a couple of weeks. And as we've talked about a couple podcasts ago, when we talked about stopping old habits, there comes a time when your own mental effort isn't enough to get you where you need to be and to accomplish the goal that you need to accomplish, because it's just not enough energy for your brain to sustain that.
That's right. Yeah. Because once again, we're talking about, we have to create circumstances that will produce these feel-good chemicals in your brain.
Right.
If you're not producing those, you're not going to be pursuing that activity. What we know about behavior is that all of us tend to do the same things over and over again because those are the things that produce the feel-good chemicals.
Right.
If they stop producing the feel-good chemicals, you're going to stop doing it.
Right.
That's why we get into routines and habits,
right,
because those are the things that make us feel good. And all of our brains are different. That's why we all have different interests and different activities. So what we're looking for with this goal is what do I need to accomplish in order to keep those feel-good chemicals flowing.
Right.
Now, in some cases, it's success.
Well, I was just going to say, what creates those feel-good chemicals?
That's right.
Success.
And you have to know that about yourself.
Right.
Because for some people, it's getting compliments from others.
Right.
I want to lose weight because I'll get compliments.
Right.
I want to lose weight because I want to say I wear a size 2. I want to lose weight because I feel better physically. I want to lose weight because I have diabetes and I don't want to take medication anymore. I don't want to take insulin.
Right.
So everybody has to figure out what it is that produces the feel-good chemicals.
Right. And what we're talking about with that is you have to define success.
Right.
All right. How do you know if you're working towards these baby steps, if you're working down the line of baby steps towards your eventual goal, how do you know that you have accomplished that next step?
Right.
And that's where you're defining success. I will know when I've made the first step, when I have, lost 2 pounds. Okay, so that's your success rate. So you weigh yourself at the beginning, you weigh yourself, however long later, and you've lost 2 pounds, success.
Right.
If that's how you're defining success, that should then increase some of those feel-good chemicals and get you motivated then, okay, so now for the next one, I need to have lost a total of 5 pounds.
Right.
And so then each of your baby steps is going to increase that. Some people can do that internally. They can do that in their mind's eye of sorts. They can think about it and they're okay with it. Other people, we have lots of patients who like to have charts on the wall so they can see it. They can chart their progress. And they create these, these are oftentimes really creative people who create these very nice visuals.
Right.
So each day they're plotting data points and they can see the trend moving in the direction towards their eventual goal. And just by seeing that creates the feel good. Even if they didn't do anything right now, even if they measured their weight or whatever it is in the morning, plotted it that morning, went to work, when they get home that evening and look at that, that's going to create those feel good chemicals again.
And this brings us to that where we talked about at the beginning, and that is that you have to know yourself well enough to know how you measure success or what you consider success to be. And when your brain starts to produce those feel-good chemicals. And that's why it's so difficult to motivate people, because everybody is a little bit different.
Right.
And for some kids, they'll respond to money. They'll respond if you give them money. Other kids respond if you give them free time.
Right.
Other kids will respond if you give them trinkets and gifts. So,
other kids respond if you just say, great job.
That's right. And so you need, if you're changing yourself, and let's talk about self because that's a little bit easier, but the same thing applies if you're trying to change the behavior of another person. If you have a child who doesn't care about money,
right,
you can offer them anything in the world. But if they don't need the money, money's not going to be motivating to them.
Right.
But everybody has something that they will work for. Okay.
Right.
The challenge is you have to know what's going to make you feel good. It's either better health. Some people smoke for 40 years and can't quit. They've tried to quit 10 or 15 or 20 times, can't quit. Then the doctor goes in and says, if you don't quit, you're going to die. Now they have enough motivation to quit. For that person, it took that threat before they had enough reason. That's how they define success. I don't want to die.
Right.
That's how I measure success.
Right. Okay. And so every day you're alive, there's another success, and there's some of that feel good.
That's producing feel-good chemicals. I'm alive.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so you need, part of this initial process, the initial process of writing it down, saying, this is my goal, here are the baby steps to get to my goal. Part of that process is you have to sort of do some introspection and say, what's going to make me feel good?
That's right.
What am I going to do? Now, this is sort of a spoiler for next week. What am I going to do when it stalls a little bit?
Yep.
How am I going to keep my motivation going? This is one place where I think that social media oftentimes is very effective, because for many people, when you post this kind of stuff on Facebook, now other people are measuring you. Other people are aware of what you're doing, and now they're going to hold you accountable. Right. You'll get those messages every once in a while. Hey, how's the working out going? Hey, how's the goal going of trying to lose weight, or working towards your degree so that you can get that new job that you want. When other people, for some people, when others are involved, and are holding you accountable, that is motivation because you don't want to disappoint others.
Right.
So you have to figure out what is beneficial for you.
That's right.
For me, Richard, you've seen my desk. I have notes, little note cards all over my desk. What really motivates me is to be able to check off the last thing on a checklist and be able to throw it away.
Right.
When I can do that, I've now accomplished something. Days when I have those notes there and there's nothing checked off of any of those lists, those are days I go home not feeling very accomplished.
Not many feel-good chemicals floating around the brain. Right.
And those tend to be days, of course, when we're here till 8 or 9 o'clock, because I got to get something checked off this list because I need to end the day, or I want to end the day feeling good about something.
Right.
Get some report done, get some article written, get something out there off that list to create some of those feel-good chemicals.
But that's the knowing yourself part of this.
Right.
You have to know what makes you feel good. The first neurologist I worked with, the man who really trained me, he would finish that day's work. When he left work that day, everything was, his charts were finished, the articles were, everything he did. And he must have discovered that over time, because when he went into work the next morning, it was a new day.
Right.
He had now it meant that some nights he didn't get out of there until 10 or 11 o'clock.
Right.
But he finished everything because that's what he needed to do to satisfy himself.
Right. So you have to know yourself. You have to know what you need to keep yourself going. And it's critical when we're talking about these kinds of goals, because when we're talking about goals that elicit change, we've talked a couple of podcasts now about how biologically that's a battle. Our brain, our body doesn't really want to change. And so we have to find these ways to increase feel-good chemicals to keep us motivated to overcome that biological underlying urge for sameness.
That's right, because we're doing what we do now because it makes us feel good.
Right.
So, my goodness, think about that for a moment. We're doing what we do now because it makes us feel good. Now we're saying, I want to change what's making me feel good, and I want to go to a whole new place.
Right.
That's extraordinarily difficult to do. It's difficult to do to yourself. It's infinitely more difficult to do to another person, because we don't know them as well as we know us.
Right. We don't know what drives that person has.
That's right. That's right.
When of course we always go back and talk about kids, but you see kids and you're talking to them and they're struggling in school, and you say, well, what do you want? What are your goals? And they say, well, I'm going to go to college. Really? You hate school. You tell me you hate school with a passion, that if you didn't have to go, you wouldn't go. And then when I ask you, what are your goals? What do you want to do? Your first thing is you want to go to college. So you want to do more of what you're saying you don't really want to do.
Right.
What he's verbalizing is his parents' goal. His parents want him to go to college. And what I worry about in those kinds of situations for those kids is, those are going to be the kids that either A, potentially feel like they're a failure if they don't go to college, because they have this imposed expectation, or they go to college and flunk out or are unsuccessful there, and then that affects their self-esteem and affects how they feel about their own abilities. And then those tend to be, or those are potentially kids who end up getting in trouble with substances and things like that, because it doesn't feel good to be here. So let me find something that's going to make me feel good. And those are oftentimes chemicals and other...
And they turn to chemicals, or they turn to music, something else.
Right.
But our brains are always searching for what makes us feel good.
Right. And so you have to know yourself. So while we're doing this process, while you're doing the process of setting your goals, identifying what you want to accomplish, do a little bit of introspection. Look at yourself. What motivates you? And not what motivates you to do, as we were saying earlier, this one thing. Okay, well, if I get my taxes done on time, then I'll reward myself with going out to eat. Okay, that's different. When we're talking about long-term goals, life-changing goals, I want to, the neurologist you were talking about who went back to school to get her master's so that she could teach. Okay, we're talking about somebody with an MD who went through, 4 years of undergraduate, 4 years of medical school, 5 years or so of residency.
Probably 3 to 5.
3 to 5 years of residency. And then she goes back to school for a year or two to become a teacher.
Right.
That requires some motivation. That requires some consideration. What is this going to do to my life?
Right.
That's a change. That's a big change in life situation. But you have to have motivation to do that.
Right.
You have to make sure, is this really what I want to do? I've mentioned it before on the podcast, but my patients often look at me sideways when they tell me that they want to do something. And oftentimes my first response is, really? Are you sure? That's really what you want to do? Mm-hmm. If it's what you want to do, fantastic. Let's make it happen. But let's make sure that it's really what you want to do first. Because if it's not, we're really going to have a hard time finding the motivation to sustain it and to keep it going and to help you be successful. I think that a lot of times that's the problem. That's a big obstacle. Once you have gotten past maybe the fears that we've talked about before, once you've gotten past the obstacle of considering that you're going to have to get outside of your comfort zone, the next obstacle is you got to make sure that it's something that you want enough that you're going to work towards it.
That's right.
That's where the motivation is going to come from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter what exercise, diet, money, whatever you're after. You better make sure you really want it, because it is going to be a difficult journey, and you're going to have to work very hard to achieve it.
Right.
Because you're asking your brain to make a very big change, a very fundamental shift in what makes you feel good.
Absolutely. And the reality is that motivation is a very powerful tool.
I think about this conversation that we're having this morning makes me think about all those kids who are accused of being lazy. Yeah. And we see dozens of them, dozens of kids who just haven't found their way yet. Mm-hmm. And that's the bigger problem, is that they simply, we know and the children know what their parents believe is important.
Right.
Okay, college and this and whatever. The kids just haven't found their thing yet. They haven't found what makes them feel good.
Exactly.
And I think that rather than pushing them in a particular direction by using extrinsic motivation, maybe we should spend more time talking to those kids about what's truly important to them.
Right.
As we say, they're motivated, they're just not motivated to do what we want them to do.
Right, because the reality is that some kids are perfectly fine with B's and C's.
Absolutely.
Even though they're perfectly capable of making all A's, sometimes they're just fine with making B's and C's.
And we know that B's and C's aren't going to buy them very much, but...
Well, they're not going to buy them the things that we think that they would want to afford.
That's right. that B's and C's aren't going to get them into the college that we want them to go to.
Right.
But maybe that's not their interest right now.
Right.
And when we say, well, I can't motivate him, you might not be able to.
Right.
Because what's important to you may not be important to them.
Right. And once we get to a certain age and of a certain position developmentally in life, you're not going to have the same influence from others as you once did. It's different to get an 8-year-old to do homework than it is to get a 17-year-old to do homework. It's a very different process, and and we have to recognize that. We have to acknowledge that and adjust accordingly.
Right.
And we're kind of getting back and talking about kids a lot, but it begins with conversation.
Right.
What are your goals? What do you want? I want you to go to Duke. Yeah, but I just want to go to Polk State. Okay? If you just want to go to Polk State,
I want you to go
fine.
I want you to go Ivy League. Mom, I don't want to go Ivy League.
Right.
That has no interest. I'm not interested in it. And if you read things like David and Goliath, not every kid should go to an Ivy League school, even if they're capable of going to it. Maybe they shouldn't.
Right.
Maybe they should go to a good state school. Maybe they should go to a junior college, just for starters. All of us have children who they really aren't interested in going to a big 4-year. I mean, I have 4 children. They all went in different directions after high school.
Right.
Some wanted to go to a big school, big university. Others didn't want to go to college at all.
Right.
Others wanted to go to a junior college for a couple of years, or a state school for a couple. Community college for a couple of years because they weren't sure and they didn't want to make a commitment, so they wanted to go. Those are all okay. All 4 decisions were good for each individual.
Right.
And so, we bang away, say, well, I don't know how to motivate him. I think we do know how to motivate them, but we have to step back and say, what does this child want to do?
Right.
What's motivating for this child? I have one of my children. My 2 boys, one boy said, do I have to go to college? And we said, no. He said, I assumed that I had to. And I said, no, you don't have to go.
Right.
At which point he went.
Right.
Okay? My other son said, I don't want to go to college. I just don't want to go to college right now. And he didn't.
So he didn't.
But he's doing just fine.
Right.
For him, that he's motivated to do what he wanted to do. And he has been productive since graduating from high school.
Exactly.
Supports himself, is doing what he wants to do, and eventually he's going to find the path that he has chosen.
Right.
Okay.
And we only have a few minutes left, but we had another great question in the chat room, and that has to do with, when you offer to your kids the opportunity to try some of these different things,
Right.
That they think that they might like, and then they realize that it requires work, and then they want to quit. Or they want to get out of it. How do you deal with that as a parent? Because certainly those things are costly.
Are you talking about the kid who said, I want to play soccer, and he starts playing and then he decides he wants to quit? Is that what you're talking about?
I think, yeah. If your kid wants to learn to sail,
Right.
and then you get him in the sailing school, and then they decide, okay, this is horrible. This isn't what I thought.
Right.
One of the things that I do with my patients and with my kids, I just had a conversation with this about baseball with a patient yesterday, is the conversation that you have to have before you do anything. When they say, I want to try baseball or I want to try soccer, the first conversation you have to have is you have to say, okay, this is a commitment. If you're going to sign up for it, whether you like it or don't like it, we have to get through this season.
Yeah, I really think you need to do that.
Right.
That's an essential parenting skill.
Right.
If you're going to make a commitment, it has to be for some period of time.
Right. Because what happens is when you join some of these things, especially if it's a team sport, your team then becomes dependent on you.
That's right.
Many of us have been on teams where we have this was when I was an adult. After high school, I played in an adult soccer league,
right.
And we had soccer has 11 players per team on the field at a time. Mm-hmm. We had 12 players,
right,
but only about 8 showed up to the games because the other guys we weren't very good. We were playing in a league with guys who had been playing together for a long time. We were just sort of a hodgepodge team just kind of put together from some of us from school, and people weren't showing up, and it was very frustrating because it's like even if you're we're not winning, even if you don't feel like you're really good, to have somebody else on the field is really important.
Right.
And so you have the conversation with your kid or with yourself if you're thinking, what, I'd really like to, as an adult, I'd really like to learn a martial art. Before you go sign up, you have to say, I'm going to commit to this amount of time, at which time I'll then reevaluate.
That's right.
And you got to commit yourself to that time frame to give yourself enough of an opportunity to experience it. Because just like we talked about last week, it's going to be outside your comfort zone.
That's right.
It's going to require you to do things that make you feel uncomfortable. And you have to work through that. You have to give it enough time to get comfortable with it.
That's right. And you're going to want to quit. Believe me.
Right.
You are going to want to quit. So set that time. How much time am I going to give this?
Right.
2 months, 3 months, 8 months, a year. Whatever it takes, because you are going to want to quit until you get proficient and start to feel good about it.
Right. Because what's going to make you start feeling good about it? When you feel like you're succeeding in some way.
Right. And that's why we say with children, with school children, if you want to increase their motivation, the first thing you have to do is increase their achievement.
Right.
You have to become competent in order to keep doing something. So we can't ask children to be motivated to do something that they don't do well.
Right.
Okay. So when I talk to teachers, I say to them, what you do best is teach. So you increase the child's achievement, and you're going to increase the child's motivation.
Right.
Okay. They're not going to be motivated until they have success.
Exactly. So I hope that answered your question. I hope this helps you understand a little bit about how important motivation is for setting goals and accomplishing those goals. If you have any questions, please write into us on Facebook or on our blog at thementalbreakdown.com. I think that's everything for this week. We have 15 seconds left. Anything else?
That's all. Have a good weekend.
All right.
Enjoy.
All right. I'm Dr.
Safe.
Berney.
I'm Dr. Richard.
Have a great weekend
And
forget to be afraid.
To be afraid.